Hi, I'm Chris Meyer of Learning Modular, and in this video I want to share with you my enthusiasm for the Make Noise LxD, or Low Strike Duo module. It's a dual low-pass gate. Now, admittedly, I come from more of an East Coast background, where you have a separate VCF or filter, and VCA or amplifier, and you route the filter into the amp. More of a West Coast approach is to have a filter and an amp in one module known as a low-pass gate. It tends to be a mild low-pass filter and a VCA, both falling off to near silence. Now, the Make Noise LxD is an interesting take on this concept. There's two halves to this module. The top half is a 12 dB or two-pole low-pass filter, so it has a little bit stronger of a roll-off. It's based loosely on Make Noise's MMG, or multi-mode gate, and it is slightly resonant. It has a separate control voltage input, which you can use for normal modulation, envelopes, etc., and a strike input to give a very percussive sound. In general, it has a fast, snappy response. The bottom half is based on Make Noise's Optimix, which has a gentler one-pole or 6 dB per octave roll-off. This particular half of the module also has a slower response, slower attack, slower decay, but other than that, it has its own CV and strike inputs as well. The output of the top half is normaled to the input of the bottom half, or you can treat it as two separate halves. I'm going to show it in two different examples. Right now I have set up a noise percussion patch, and in a minute I'll show a sequence patch using oscillators. Let me explain this patch quickly. I'm using an Expert Sleeper's Disting in patch 3A, which is their sample and hold. I'm taking the noise output and using it as the voltage to be sampled on the input. I'm also taking that noise and using it as the audio source for the filter. To clock the sample and hold, I'm using an output from an LFO from the Roland 540, just using a square wave, and the leading edge is used both to trigger the sample in the sample and hold, and also to trigger an envelope I'll be playing around with. I'll also use that leading edge to trigger the strike input. The output of the sample and hold, a randomly varying voltage in steps, is being used to control the cutoff of my filter, a Doepfer SEM clone. Let's just quickly listen to that in isolation. I have a fair amount of resonance on it, just to give it a bit more bite. And I have control over its frequency range and how widely varied the input is. So that's our input. I'm going to take that and route it to the input first of the top half of the LxD. Then I'll route the output of the LxD into our WMD Pro output. To trigger the LxD, first let's use the CV or control voltage input. As I mentioned, I have my LFO, which is my main clock in the system, triggering an ADSR. So let's take the output of that ADSR and route it to the CV input. I have a pretty bright percussive sound. Let me roll that off a bit. And slow down. And I control how long the release is. So you hear it has a pretty sharp attack on this, and is capable of a very fast release. This little tick sounds. A little bit of attack to it. You can hear that slight rolling of the attack sound. Now let's take that same trigger, which is starting the envelope, and instead use it to trigger the strike input on that same module. Now you get a very brief tick sort of sound, very percussive. Again, the top half of the LxD tends to have faster response than the bottom half of the LxD, but both halves use what are known as factorals, LEDs controlling light-sensitive resistors. And those are known for having a particular character that has a nice rounded attack, a nice decay, and a bit of ringing at the top of the attack. Great for percussive sounds. So that's what the two-pole or 12 dB half sounds like. Let's go ahead and patch into the bottom half, which is 6 dB. And just for consistency, I'll use the strike input again. You hear where it's much brighter, it has more of a decay. The strike inputs actually have a faster attack on them than the CV inputs do. Let's go ahead and use this to trigger our envelope again. And now pull that into the CV input. You hear more of a rounded off attack. We can slow this down. Or play it fast. As I mentioned, you can cascade these two together. So let's take the input to the top of the LxD. I'll take the envelope out and use that for the CV portion of the 12 dB section, but I'll take a copy of this gate that I'm using for my strike signal to excite the bottom half, the 6 dB section. So we're getting more of the rounded character of the top half of the module, with a nice percussive strike of the bottom half of the module. Nice percussive sound to it. I do like the sound of this module. But that's what it sounds like for noise-based percussion. Let's try something more pitched, like a sequence driving a pair of oscillators. Okay, now let's try the LxD with something more tonal, something with oscillators in it. Let me explain this patch first. I've got the MIDI 3 acting as a clock for my sequencer. The sequencer is driving both oscillators in a Roland 512, with a little bit of pulse width modulation coming from an LFO. And that raw sound through a dot mix sounds like this. Good fat sound. Now, if we take that output and put it into the input of, say, the 6 dB low-pass gate, plucked by the gate signal from the MIDI 3, and run that to the output, the result is this nice, meaty pluck sound. I mean, taste is subjective, but I really like this. It has just a really nice rounded attack, good spunk, strong bass, nice tone to it. Now know that the strike input on the LxD is a little bit sensitive to the length of the trigger coming into it. If you go too short, you see you barely get an excitement out of it, barely a trigger. But if you have just a slightly longer gate, that's where you get that really nice plucked sound. Now, of course, I could take this trigger into the CV input as well, but it wouldn't be as interesting. It'd be just a square envelope. And there, gate duration does matter. It's kind of like note length. Notice that the attack is much more rounded through the CV input than it is through the strike input. Very fast attack, very plucky there, compared to something a bit of slew, a bit of rounding on it. Love that tone, and you can hear the Vactral decay away when I pull out the strike. Okay, let's try that into the 12 dB input. I'll route the input up to the 12, take its output, and initially try its strike. Remember, it had a much faster attack and decay than the 6 dB section. Now you just get that really tiny blip. If you go down to a very short trigger, very percussive hit. A little bit of duration. And again, it's not so interesting if you take it into the CV input, because then you have a square wave envelope, which isn't nearly as interesting. But what is interesting is to go ahead and use an envelope generator to drive that CV input. I have a copy of my gate triggering the envelope on a Roland 540. I'll take its output into the CV input. Now you get that really nice fat pluck sound. Gate duration matters here. If my gate is too short, it will skip the decay stage and go into my longer release stage. Nice classic two-pole sound, very meaty. If I lengthen up my gate or my note on time, the decay cycle is going all the way to the sustain. So I can go ahead and play with my sustain level. And again, I like how heavy and meaty that sound is. Now remember, the LxD cascades the output of the 12 dB section into the input of the 6 dB section. Let's go ahead and take our audio output from the 6 dB and hit it with a strike signal again. Now I have a more rounded, closed sound. Remember, just the 6 dB section sounds like this. The classic low-pass gate pluck. But when processed through the envelope of the 12 dB section, now I've got that meaty sound with the pluck of the strike on the 6 dB. Now the really cool thing about the LxD is that you don't need to restrict yourself to gates and triggers for the strike and CV inputs. You can go ahead and use other modulation sources such as LFOs or even oscillators. Let me demonstrate that. I'll pull the envelope for now. Let me get a longer cable. Instead, let's play around with frequency modulating the CV from one of the additional waveform outs on the 512. Different waveform and different oscillator will give different sounds. I can even play with the pulse width on this second oscillator. That's pretty cool. It's a lot of fun. Now another trick is to use an LFO, so you basically have a filter and an amp opening and closing. I'm going to use this second envelope generator in the Roland 540 in cycle mode so that it repeats. I take it into my Manhattan control voltage processor so I can offset it above and below 0 volts and take that into the CV input. As it goes through the attack and decay stages, you can hear the filter open and close. I can offset that. Or go wide open. Take it so it just barely peaks above 0 volts. Let's go crazy with it. Now I'm actually FMing it a little bit with a very fast envelope. So the LxD is a very flexible module. I think it's worth having in your system. I personally like its sound quite a bit. So if you don't have a low-pass gauge yet, or even if you're just the slightest bit LPG curious, it's just 4 HP and barely over $100. Find space in your system. I'll bet you find a lot of use for it in your patches, for sequences, percussion, etc. I've certainly been having a lot of fun with it.